Sharon, and I'm here with Lynn Bornstein, who is the author of Laura English. And I was privileged to read it, and I like it very much. And I'd like to ask you, do you have a one sentence or a one paragraph description of your book?
Well, very briefly, I can tell you that it's the story of a woman's life, and it begins when she's 7 and it goes to 40 years after that. And it's the story of how a young girl discovers very early in her life that the way to receive love is through performance. And I think that that is the shortest way I can say what motivates and what drives this character.
Do you explore that as
Yes.
Is that considered a positive thing, or does she find a problem with that?
It's a positive thing, and it also causes a lot of problems in her life with relationships. Should I tell you a little bit?
Can, sure.
As I said, this tale begins in the Blitz in London, and this little girl is 7 years old, and her father's a doctor, and her mother only is interested in her father. She's a very cold woman, and she's almost a little jealous of her daughter because her father loves his daughter so much. The father loves her daughter so much, his daughter so much. And when the war breaks out, he is sent away to a hospital in Bournemouth to take care of the wounded when the war begins. It hasn't begun yet. So she eventually is sent away to Bournemouth to some relatives of her mother. And there she discovers real love from this couple, and they become surrogate parents for her. And she grows up there. And this child, during the war that was so frightening, and also her issues with her mother, she has always made up plays in her head with her fairy tales, with just out of her imagination. She creates little theatricals, and that's the way she escapes. So when she goes to Bournemouth, she imitates the townspeople for her aunt and uncle, and they respond, they love it. And eventually, an uncle comes home from the war, and he's too old to be in the war, but he has been entertaining the troops all through the war. He's an actor, and he's her aunt's brother. And he establishes a theater in Bournemouth. And that does it for this character. Her name is Jane Parks. And she begins hanging out at the theater, painting scenery, sewing costumes, and finally her uncle realizes she's been repeating all the lines for the players, so he makes her the prompter. And eventually she becomes an actress with this troupe he has established in Bournemouth. And at that time in her life, she also meets the love of her life, so she's very happy. One night, in one of these performances, a very famous director-producer from London in a studio that's based loosely on Rank Studios is an old friend of her uncle's. He comes to see the performance. He is blown away by this young girl to a particular part he hasn't been able to cast. So he brings her to London, and there she meets a whole wonderful family of actors at this studio.
Does she change her name at that point?
Yes, she does get this part. She's very good in the part. It's a small part, but she gets a lot of recognition. And at that time, they change her name. And the name changing scene is, I think it's fun in the book. And eventually, she becomes quite famous. Lots of things happen I'm not going to tell because I don't want to give away the plot. But she does go to Hollywood eventually, and she travels to Northern California. She ends up buying a home in Belvedere, and lots of exciting things happen. There is some intrigue in the book. There's some a lot having to do with the Israeli Palestinian conflict. There's assassinations. There's a lot going on.
Unexpected.
Unexpected in a book such as this.
So what is it that brought you to write this book, and why in London? Why?
That's kind of an interesting story because I've written all my life, and I've done a lot of expository writing for different advertising and also development work, but I always wrote on the side. And I had an idea for a story where a body is found at Bontempi Reservoir. And it's all the prologue about finding this body. And then the body of the book would be 5 characters who all knew this person who died, and they all had a reason to kill him. But of course, in the end, none of them are the ones, it's another person. And as I was writing these stories of these people, one just captured me. I just fell in love with her, and that was Laura English. So I decided to scrap that first story and write a story.
I was just getting into it when you were talking about
They got scrapped, and I wanted to write about her. So that's how that happened. And these characters arrived, named, all developed. It's just amazing when you're writing fiction like that, how these characters appear.
When you say that they appear, is it something, I think I've thought about this question before, something that happens while you're writing? Is it something that happens when you're doing something totally not writing? It just comes to you?
No, it's in the writing process. I knew what the plot was going to be. I knew from beginning to end what was going to happen. But the characters sort of were there as if I thought, well, she marries this person. She's going to meet him and develop her and marry him. That person in my mind was already the description, his name, everything. And yes, walking is a great release for me for writing, but not so much with this book. It was just really sitting down for many years and seeing it.
So you worked on it for many years?
Many years.
How often at a time would you...
Hold it up.
Yeah, that's a good idea. How often at a time would you be working?
Well, I work
Typically.
for a year at a time and then put it away.
No, I mean, like, here's a day. How
Yeah,
much time
all
during
day.
the day? Oh, really?
All day, like 8 hours.
And then the next day?
And the next
You
day,
really-
and then there'd be a couple of days when I was doing something else and I'd go back to
Well,
it.
that's pretty disciplined.
It would be
I
like
would
all
say.
day, yeah. Well, it wasn't a question even of discipline, it was a question of not ending. I had to stop and make my husband dinner and I didn't want to stop. But lots of revision. I mean, it was revision.
Did you write the whole thing as a rough draft and then revise it, or did you write a chunk and revise that and write a chunk and revise that?
I had a big chart giving every character's name, when they were born, all the different highlights of their life for all the characters to keep them all straight. So it was, I would write a chapter, say, or a section.
Yeah.
And then I'd go back and revise and revise and revise and then begin on the next. But I knew what was coming next.
That's interesting. Well, I think it's important that the viewer understand that this is one way to do it, and it's a very respectable way. It's not the way everyone writes.
Oh, no,
And
no.
there really is no rule book about how to write fiction.
No.
So, but it's just I'm impressed by your diligence, and the way you did it is very
Well,
interesting.
it was a labor of love, really. And when it was over, and I knew, I had written the epilogue, and I knew this is it, it was very sad. I mean, you feel a great sense of loss.
Oh yeah. What is it? Post-writerly depression? or
Exactly,
something like that?
exactly.
What's the story with the cover? I know you searched for
Yes,
that
yes.
image.
I did. This is exactly what Laura English looked like, and I was determined to find an image. And my publisher said, "Oh, that's nothing. We'll do a beautiful cover for you." I said, "No, I know what I want." And I looked for a day and a half on Google, and I found, as soon as I saw it, that's her.
Oh my God.
The only
Yeah.
difference is she has an aquiline nose, this character, and this one doesn't. But that's all. Otherwise, and I think the image looks kind of theatrical. It looks celebratory.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So the artist is a Swedish artist named Gun Lager, and we contacted her. My publisher did, and she gave us the rights for a very minimal cost, and I was astounded.
Great.
But we were very lucky to get this because it's a compelling image, I think.
So when you looked through Google at the different images, did you ask for a red-haired woman?
Yes, Exactly.
Yeah.
Paintings of a and then my
Paintings of
publisher
a
said,
redhead.
well, oh, we could Photoshop. She could be anything. I didn't know about that. I just,
It's wonderful. It's magical how you found her.
yes,
That image, I mean.
yes.
Did you know at the time that you wrote how you would get this book into print?
No, had no idea. This was just writing for myself. And then I have been taking a memoir writing class for about 6 years. And so about 3 years ago, my wonderful teacher, Jackie Cudler, I'll give her a plug, at College of Marin, she teaches memoir. She always writes on the board, editors, if you want to get your work published. And this manuscript had been sitting in my house for so long, and I thought, So I won't bore you with how I came up with the name, but the name was very magical to me, how I picked all these lists of editors. And so I contacted her and I asked if I could send the manuscript. And she said yes, she would take a look. And she did, and she called me back and she said, I would very much like to be your editor. And so she was wonderful.
Wow.
Because the writing itself was okay. It was when a good editor will say, this doesn't quite make sense. You have to clarify this.
Yeah.
This timing confuses me a little bit. And so I worked one whole summer on all her notes.
Very good. Do you want to read a little bit from Laura English?
Yeah, I'll read just a little bit because
Yeah.
I don't want to give too much away.
Right.
Of the
Well, we
plot.
only have about 3 minutes
Oh,
for you
dear.
to read. So.
Okay, so as I said, she had a very cold mother and she wasn't getting much love from her mother, but this is where she discovers what her talents could bring her. So London is going through the Blitz. Almost a year to the day of Chamberlain's speech, the so-called phony war turned real, and the Germans began nightly bombing raids on London. As she lay in bed waiting for the inevitable sirens, Jane created elaborate theatricals behind her closed lids until her mind drifted into nothingness, only to be jolted awake by the dreaded wine. Groping her way out of bed, she struggled into her shoes and coat, grabbed the square brown box that held her gas mask, and trailed her mother out of the house and around the corner to the shelter that was, as always, filled with the sounds of crying children and the smell of too many bodies crammed too tightly together. The noise from above that night seemed more terrifying than usual. All about them, women were comforting crying children. Jane ached for a warm arm around her thin shoulders. Tentatively, she moved her fingers along the folds of her mother's skirt, careful not to crease the pleated woolen fabric. Slowly, she placed her small hand over her mother's, but Gladys Parks, whose thoughts were miles away in Liverpool, remained oblivious to her daughter's touch. As Jane sat through the suffocating night, waiting for the all-clear, she studied the faces of the people in the shelter. Apart from a few old men huddled against the sloping wall, it seemed to be occupied solely by women and children. All the men are off fighting, she thought, and whispered to some long ago imagined guardian angel, please keep my daddy safe. Her glance fell on a young woman who sat caressing her daughter's dark curls while rhythmically stroking the back of a tiny infant who lay sleeping across her knees. Suddenly Jane felt, as she had done once, sprawled on the ground after falling out of a swing, with all the breath knocked out of her. As she watched the young mother gently soothing her children, she thought, until that moment had only been a hint of a suspicion, to soothe her children, a thought which until that moment had only been a hint of a suspicion, took shape. Turning to look at her mother's face, pale and beautiful in the half-light, she knew with stinging clarity and utter certainty that her own mother could not love her. Shivering, Jane closed her eyes and once again turned her mind to the stage behind her eyes, where the performance which had been interrupted by the shrieking sirens continued. Music played in her mind, and dancers floated across a pink-lit stage. Jane hummed the tune. Eyes now open, she started to sway. It was an old-fashioned, much-loved song. Softly she began to sing the words, and as she did, she felt a budding lightness in her body, as if, by simply willing it, she could lift herself up off the ground and fly. Without thinking, she was on her feet dancing in the spaces between the huddled bodies. A feeling of total bliss welled inside her as all around she saw smiling faces. Broadening her gestures, she sang the chorus again. "Another, sing another," voices shouted when it was over. Jane glanced in the direction of her mother. She was smiling, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Yes, Jane," she breathed, "do sing another." Jane sang and danced until the all-clear siren finally sounded. Oh dear.
Our time is...
Oh dear. Well, okay.
Tell people where they can find your book, because they might want to read it. And
well, anyway, that's how she got her mother to react to her. The book was at Book Passage and Copperfields in Petaluma, but the easiest way is on Amazon. And it's Laura English, and if you look at it under Lynn Bornstein, it'll pop right up. That's it.
thank you so much.
Thank
Lynn.
you.
Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you,
It's a good
Sharon.
book. I like it.
Thank you, Sharon.
You're welcome.